Dakota Territory, late autumn of 1886. The plains stretched endless under a sky heavy with the threat of early snow. The air was sharp enough to cut through wool and skin alike, carrying with it the scent of dried grass and distant pine. In the small trading settlement of Broken Ridge, most men kept their heads down and their business to themselves. Survival in this unforgiving land meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. It meant keeping your rifle clean, your supplies rationed, and your family close. Wade Grant was one of those men. At 36 years old, he had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much hardship and learned to shoulder it without complaint. His face was lean and sun-darkened, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions. His hands were calloused from years of hauling freight, splitting wood, and building the modest trading post that now stood at the eastern edge of Broken Ridge. It was a simple structure, built from rough-hewn logs and patched with whatever materials he could scavenge or trade for. But it was his, and more importantly, it was shelter. Since the death of his wife Martha 3 years prior, Wade had spoken little and trusted even less. The fever that took her had come on fast during the brutal winter of 1883, sweeping through the settlement like a curse. Within a week, she was gone, leaving behind only memories and a 7-year-old boy who barely understood what death meant. Wade had buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross and a handful of wildflowers that wilted in the frozen ground. He had not remarried. He had not even considered it. His world had shrunk to 2 things, his son Levi and the trade that kept them fed. Levi was a quiet boy, thoughtful beyond his years. He had his mother's dark, intelligent eyes and his father's steady hands. He rarely smiled anymore, not since the fever took Martha. But he was observant, always watching, always noticing things others missed. Wade often wondered if the boy remembered his mother's voice, her laugh, the way she used to hum old hymns while kneading bread in the morning light. He hoped so, even though the thought carved a hollow ache in his chest every time. Sometimes, late at night, Wade would catch Levi staring at the small wooden box where they kept Martha's few belongings. A comb, a faded ribbon, a Bible with her name inscribed inside. The boy never said anything, but Wade knew. Grief was a silent companion in their home. It was Levi who found her. The morning had begun like any other. The sun rose pale and cold over the prairie, casting long shadows across the settlement. Wade was outside loading supplies onto the wagon, preparing for a run to Fort Ridgeway to deliver pelts and pick up winter provisions. The fort was a 2-day ride northeast, and Wade made the trip once a month, sometimes more if the trading was good. It was dangerous work. Bandits, hostile tribes, and the weather itself could all turn deadly without warning. But it paid well enough to keep them comfortable through the winter, and Wade had learned to navigate the risks. Levi had been playing near the edge of the settlement, a spot where the crude wooden buildings gave way to open prairie. He was throwing stones at a rusted tin can he had set up on a fence post, a simple game he played to pass the time. Wade glanced over occasionally, keeping an eye on the boy while he worked. The settlement was relatively safe during the day, but Wade never let Levi wander too far. Not after what happened to the Miller boy last spring. That child had strayed too far from home and hadn't been seen since. Some said it was wolves. Others whispered darker things. Suddenly, Levi stopped. His small body went rigid, his head tilting, as if he were listening to something distant and faint. Wade noticed the change immediately. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, his eyes narrowing. "Levi," Wade called out. "What is it, son?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he began walking slowly toward the scrub brush and scattered cottonwoods that marked the boundary between the settlement and the open prairie. His steps were cautious, deliberate, like he was following a sound only he could hear. Wade frowned and set down the crate he was holding. His hand instinctively moved to the knife sheathed at his belt. "Out here you didn't take chances." He followed his son, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. They walked perhaps 100 yards, the settlement shrinking behind them. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant cry of a hawk. Levi stopped abruptly at the edge of a thicket of tangled brush and tall grass. Wade came up beside him, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Wade asked quietly. Levi pointed. "There, Pa, in the grass." Wade followed his son's gaze and saw it. Half hidden among the tall grasses and twisted brush was an old wagon, listing badly to one side. One of the wheels was shattered, the spokes jutting out like broken bones. The canvas cover was torn and flapping in the wind, faded and sun-bleached. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like a ghost from some failed crossing. Wagons like this weren't uncommon on the prairie. Plenty of settlers had tried to make it west and failed, leaving behind their belongings and sometimes their lives. "Stay here," Wade said quietly, but Levi was already moving forward. The boy approached the wagon cautiously, his small frame almost swallowed by the tall grass. Wade quickened his pace to catch up, his senses heightened. As they drew closer, Wade's pulse began to hammer in his ears. There were dark stains on the wagon bed, dried and rust-colored. Blood. His jaw tightened. He reached out and placed a hand on Levi's shoulder, stopping him. "Let me go first," Wade said firmly. Levi nodded, stepping back. Wade moved forward, his hand now resting on the handle of his knife. He circled the wagon slowly, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The area was quiet, no tracks, no signs of recent activity. Whatever had happened here, it had been days ago, maybe longer. He climbed up onto the broken wheel, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and peered into the wagon. His breath caught. Inside, crumpled among torn blankets and shattered crates, lay a woman. She was motionless, her clothing torn and stained with dirt and blood. Her face was bruised and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. Her wrists bore the marks of rope burns, angry red welts that told a story of captivity and violence. Her hair, once perhaps carefully pinned, now hung in matted tangles around her shoulders. She looked like she had been discarded, left to die like refuse. Wade's heart pounded. For a moment, he saw Martha lying there pale and still, and the old grief surged up like a flood. He blinked hard, forcing the image away, forcing himself to focus. Then the woman stirred. Her head moved slightly, and Wade realized with a jolt that her eyes were open. But they didn't focus on him. They stared straight ahead, unseeing, clouded with a milky film that spoke of blindness. She was blind. "Ma'am," Wade said softly, keeping his voice low and steady. "Can you hear me?" The woman flinched at the sound, her breath quickening. Her hands came up defensively, trembling, as if expecting a blow. "Easy," Wade said, raising his hands slowly where she couldn't see them, though he kept his voice calm. "We're not going to hurt you. I'm Wade Grant. This is my son, Levi. We're from the settlement just over the rise." The woman's lips parted, but no sound came. She was shaking now, whether from cold or fear, Wade couldn't tell. Probably both. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and Wade could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath her torn dress. Levi, still perched on the wheel beside his father, leaned forward. His eyes were fixed not on the woman's face, but on something glinting at her throat. A delicate silver chain, partially hidden beneath her torn collar. He reached out instinctively, his small fingers brushing the metal. The woman gasped and pulled back sharply, her hands flying to her throat in a protective gesture. But Levi had already seen it. A locket, tarnished but unmistakable, hanging from the thin chain. His breath hitched, and he turned to his father with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Pa," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's Mama's locket." Wade froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at his son, then at the woman, then at the thin silver chain around her neck. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Time seemed to slow. The wind, the distant sounds of the settlement, everything faded into a dull roar in his ears. "What did you say?" His voice came out hoarse, barely audible. Levi's small hand was still extended, trembling. "The locket, Pa. It's the one Mama used to wear. The one with the little bird on it." Wade's mind reeled. Martha's locket had been buried with her. He had placed it in her hands himself before they lowered her into the frozen ground. He remembered it vividly. The cold weight of the silver, the way it had caught the winter sunlight one last time before disappearing into the earth. There was no way this woman could have it, unless someone had dug up Martha's grave. The thought sent a cold fury coursing through him, a rage so intense it made his hands shake. But then he looked at the woman again, truly looked at her. She was barely conscious, starving, brutalized. This was no thief. This was a victim. "Let me see it," Wade said quietly, his voice tight. The woman whimpered and tried to pull away, but she was too weak. Her movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. Wade reached out slowly, carefully, and lifted the locket from where it rested against her collarbone. His fingers brushed the cold metal and his breath caught. It was identical, the same delicate filigree, the same tiny engraved bird on the front, wings spread as if in flight. Wade's hands trembled as he pressed the small clasp. The locket opened with a soft click. Inside was a faded photograph, so worn it was barely visible. But Wade could make out the image, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was wearing a high-collared dress, her hair pinned up in the style of a decade past. It wasn't Martha. Relief and confusion crashed over him in equal measure. It wasn't Martha's locket after all. Just one remarkably impossibly similar. But the coincidence was staggering. What were the chances? Wade's mind struggled to make sense of it. Levi was staring at the woman now, his face a mixture of hope and confusion. "Pa, who is she?" Wade closed the locket gently and let it fall back against the woman's chest. "I don't know, son, but we're going to find out." He climbed fully into the wagon, the wood groaning under his weight, and slipped his arms beneath the woman. She was light, far too light, her body wasted from starvation and neglect. He lifted her as gently as he could, cradling her against his chest. She made a small sound of protest, a weak whimper, but she didn't fight. She didn't have the strength. "Levi, run ahead and tell Mrs. Calloway we're coming. Tell her we need blankets, hot water, and anything she can spare for someone who's been hurt. Go now." Levi nodded and took off at a sprint, his small legs pumping hard across the prairie grass. Wade watched him go for a moment, then began the slow walk back toward the settlement. The woman's head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and uneven. He could feel the fragility of her, the way her ribs pressed against his arms, the way her body trembled even in unconsciousness. By the time he reached the edge of Broken Ridge, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast, as it always did in small settlements. Mrs. Calloway, the settlement's unofficial healer, stood at the front, her face stern but her eyes sharp with concern. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, and hands that had delivered half the babies in Broken Ridge. Beside her were a handful of trappers, settlers and traders, all watching with varying expressions of curiosity, suspicion and unease. "What in heaven's name have you brought back, Wade?" Mrs. Calloway asked, her hands already moving to check the woman's pulse at her neck. "Found her in a busted wagon out past the cottonwoods," Wade said, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. "Looks like she's been beaten, starved, and left to die." A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the trappers, a grizzled man named Henson with a scar running down his left cheek, spat into the dirt. "Could be trouble. Could be an outlaw's woman, or worse. Could be she's running from something we don't want following her here." Wade's jaw tightened. "She's blind," he said sharply, his eyes cutting to Henson, "and half dead. Whatever she is, she's not a threat." Mrs. Calloway nodded briskly, her expression brooking no argument. "Bring her to my cabin. We'll get her cleaned up and see if we can keep her breathing. The rest of you, go on about your business. There's nothing to see here." The crowd hesitated, then slowly began to disperse, though Wade could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispers starting already. He ignored them and followed Mrs. Calloway through the narrow dirt path between cabins. Levi trailed close behind, his face pale and worried. Inside Mrs. Calloway's cabin, the air was warm and thick with the smell of herbs and wood smoke. Wade laid the woman on a narrow cot near the stove, stepping back to give the older woman room to work. Mrs. Calloway immediately set to work, her movements efficient and practiced. She stripped away the woman's torn clothing, replacing it with a clean linen shift. She cleaned the wounds with a damp cloth, her face impassive as she worked. "Boy, go fetch me another bucket of water from the well," Mrs. Calloway said without looking up. Levi hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the woman, then obeyed, slipping out the door. Wade stood to the side, arms crossed, watching the woman's pale, bruised face. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She would survive, at least for now. But the questions weighed heavy on him. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why did she have a locket so similar to Martha's? Who do you think she is?" Mrs. Calloway asked quietly as she wrapped a bandage around the woman's wrists. "Don't know," Wade replied, his voice flat. "But someone wanted her dead." Mrs. Calloway glanced up at him, her sharp eyes studying his face. "You bringing trouble to Broken Ridge, Wade?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But leaving her out there would have been murder." The older woman grunted, which Wade took as grudging approval. She finished her work and covered the woman with thick woolen blankets, tucking them carefully around her frail body. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Snow was coming. Wade could smell it in the air, that cold, metallic scent that always preceded the first snowfall. Levi returned with the water, setting it down carefully beside the cot. He moved to the edge of the bed and stared down at the woman, his young face serious and troubled. "Pa," he said softly, "why does she have Mama's locket?" Wade crouched beside his son, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's not Mama's, son, just one that looks like it. But why?" Levi's voice was small, confused, filled with the kind of innocent bewilderment that cut straight to Wade's heart. Wade didn't have an answer. He wished he did. He wished he could make sense of it for his son, for himself. But all he had were questions. Mrs. Calloway finished cleaning up and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "She'll sleep for a while. Whether she wakes up, well, that's in God's hands now." Wade nodded. "I'll stay with her." "Suit yourself," the older woman said, her tone softening slightly. "But folks are already talking. You'd best be ready for questions come morning." Wade knew she was right. By dawn, the entire settlement would be buzzing with rumors and suspicion. Strangers were never just strangers out here. They were threats, mysteries, problems waiting to explode. But for now, all he could do was wait. He pulled a wooden chair close to the cot and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Levi curled up on the floor beside him, leaning against his father's leg, still clutching his coat. The fire crackled softly in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The woman lay motionless, her chest rising and falling in the firelight. The locket glinted softly at her throat, catching the light with each shallow breath. And Wade couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, predictable life in Broken Ridge had just ended. The woman didn't wake that night, nor the next morning. She lay silent and still on Mrs. Calloway's cot, her breathing so shallow that Wade found himself checking every hour to make sure she was still alive. Each time he pressed his fingers gently to her wrist, feeling for the faint flutter of her pulse, a knot of tension would ease slightly in his chest. But it always returned, tightening with each passing hour of her unconsciousness. The bruises on her face had deepened to purple and yellow, spreading across her cheekbones like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Her wrists, wrapped in clean bandages that Mrs. Calloway changed twice daily, bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged restraint. The skin was raw and torn in places, the rope burned so deep they would likely scar permanently. Someone had kept her bound for days, maybe weeks. Someone had wanted her to suffer. By mid-morning of the second day, Broken Ridge was alive with speculation. The trading post saw more visitors than usual, each one stopping by with thinly veiled curiosity, disguised as neighborly concern. Old trappers who normally kept to themselves suddenly needed nails or tobacco. Settlers' wives who usually sent their husbands for supplies came personally, their eyes darting toward Mrs. Calloway's cabin as they pretended to examine fabric or flour. They asked about supplies, about the weather, about Wade's upcoming trip to Fort Ridgeway, but their eyes kept drifting toward the small cabin across the way, and their questions eventually, inevitably, turned to the stranger. "I heard you found someone out on the prairie," Mrs. Henderson said as she ran her fingers over a bolt of cotton. She was a plump woman with sharp eyes and a tongue that moved faster than a rattlesnake's strike. "In a wagon, they say. All beaten up." Wade kept his expression neutral as he measured out her order. "That's right. Any idea who she is?" "No, ma'am." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice, though they were the only two in the store. "Folks are saying she might be running from the law, or maybe she's involved with outlaws. You know how dangerous it is bringing strangers into a settlement like this. Remember what happened over in Willow Creek when they took in that drifter? 3 people ended up dead." Wade set the measured cotton on the counter with more force than necessary. "She's half dead herself, Mrs. Henderson. I don't think she's much of a threat to anyone." The woman pursed her lips, clearly unsatisfied with his answer, but she took her purchase and left. Wade watched her go, knowing that within the hour, every household in Broken Ridge would have heard her version of events, embellished and twisted to suit whatever narrative fed the town's appetite for drama. Wade said little to anyone. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best defense against gossip. But the questions gnawed at him too, eating away at his thoughts during the quiet moments when he should have been focusing on inventory or repairs. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? What had she done, or seen, or known that had made someone want to leave her for dead in the middle of the Dakota prairie? And most troubling of all, most impossible to dismiss or explain away, how had she come to possess a locket so eerily, impossibly similar to the one he had buried with Martha 3 years ago? Levi had barely left the woman's side. The boy sat on the floor near the cot for hours at a time, playing quietly with the small carved animals Wade had made for him years ago. A horse with a flowing mane, a buffalo with stubby horns, a wolf mid-howl. Martha had loved those little figures, had encouraged Wade to make them, saying they would be treasures Levi would keep his whole life. The boy arranged them carefully on the worn floorboards, creating elaborate scenes of prairie life, but his attention was always divided. Every few minutes, he would look up at the woman's face, studying her with an intensity that made Wade uneasy. There was something in his son's eyes, something Wade couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, or longing, or maybe just the desperate wish of a child who had lost too much too young. It was as if Levi believed, truly believed, in the way only children can, that this stranger might somehow bring his mother back. "Son," Wade said gently, crouching beside Levi on the 3rd morning. The boy had been there since dawn, having slipped out of their cabin before Wade even woke. "She's not Mama, you know that, don't you?" Levi didn't look at him. His small fingers traced the carved horse in his hands, following the lines of the mane with careful precision. "I know, Pa," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight no 7-year-old should have to bear. "But she has Mama's locket. That means something. It has to mean something." Wade didn't know how to respond. He wanted to tell his son that coincidences happened, that the world was full of strange parallels and meaningless connections that looked like fate, but were just the random collision of unrelated events. But looking at the silver chain glinting against the woman's throat, catching the morning light filtering through the cabin window, he found the words stuck in his throat. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he wondered the same thing. That afternoon, Sheriff Clayton Moss arrived. Wade saw him coming from the window of the trading post, his tall frame unmistakable, even at a distance. Clayton was a man in his 50s, with a thick grey beard that he kept meticulously trimmed and eyes that missed nothing. He had been the law in Broken Ridge for nearly 15 years, and while he was fair, he was also cautious. Too many settlements had been destroyed by harboring the wrong people, by trusting too quickly or asking too few questions. Clayton had seen good men die because they opened their doors to strangers who brought violence in their wake. Wade met him outside Mrs. Calloway's cabin, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. He respected Clayton, but he also knew the sheriff's first priority would always be the safety of the settlement, not the life of one unconscious stranger. "Wade," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His voice was cordial but professional. "Heard you brought someone in. Thought I'd come take a look if you don't mind." "She's in no condition to answer questions," Wade said evenly, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. "Didn't say I was going to question her," Clayton replied, his expression patient. "Just want to see who we're dealing with. You know how people get, Wade. Rumors start flying, and before you know it, half the settlement thinks we're harboring outlaws or worse. I need to be able to give folks facts, not speculation." Wade stepped aside reluctantly, understanding the logic even if he didn't like it. The sheriff entered the cabin, removing his hat as he did, a gesture of respect that Wade appreciated. Mrs. Calloway looked up from her seat near the stove, where she was mending a shirt with quick, efficient stitches. She gave Clayton a curt nod, her expression making it clear she wouldn't tolerate any nonsense in her space. Clayton approached the cot slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. He studied the woman's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Wade watched him carefully, trying to gauge what the sheriff was thinking. Clayton's gaze traveled over the bruises, the bandaged wrists, the hollow cheeks. Then his eyes dropped to the locket at her throat. He reached out and lifted it gently, his weathered fingers careful not to disturb her. He examined the engraving closely, turning the locket to catch the light. "Seen one of these before?" he said quietly, his voice thoughtful. "Long time ago, maybe 10 years. Woman down in Deadwood had one just like it. I was passing through on territorial business. She was at the general store, and the light caught it just right. Beautiful piece. She said it was a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother who'd come over from England." Wade's pulse quickened, his interest sharpening. "You remember her name?" Clayton shook his head slowly, his brow furrowing with the effort of memory. "No, wish I did. But I remember she said there were only a dozen or so of these lockets ever made. Some jeweler back east, Philadelphia maybe, made them special back in the 40s or 50s. Had a waiting list a mile long, only worked with precious metals, and did all the engraving by hand. Each one was unique, but they all had that little bird. Said it was supposed to symbolize the soul taking flight, hope, freedom, something like that." He let the locket fall back against the woman's chest with careful reverence. "If this woman has one, she's either from money, old money, or she stole it from someone who was. Those things are worth more than most folks around here make in 5 years. "She didn't steal it," Levi said suddenly from the corner where he'd been sitting so quietly they'd almost forgotten he was there. His voice was firm, defensive, with an edge of anger that surprised Wade. "She wouldn't do that." Clayton glanced at the boy, his expression softening in the way adults do when a child says something naive but earnest. "You don't know that, son. You don't know anything about her." "I do," Levi insisted, standing up now, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I can tell. She's not bad. She's hurt. There's a difference. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Wade placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent warning not to push further, not to make this harder than it already was. But he felt a surge of pride, too, at his boy's conviction, his willingness to defend someone who couldn't defend herself. Clayton turned back to Wade, his expression serious now. "All business. I'll send word to the nearby forts and settlements. See if anyone's reported a missing woman matching her description. But Wade, you need to be careful. If she's running from something, that something might come looking for her. And when it does, you and your boy could be caught in the middle. I've seen it happen before. Good people get hurt because they tried to help the wrong person." "I know the risks," Wade said quietly, meeting the sheriff's eyes steadily. "But I couldn't leave her out there to die. That would have made me something I'm not willing to be." Clayton studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. "I'm sure you do. Just make sure you're ready for them. Keep your rifle close and your doors locked at night. And if anything strange happens, anyone asking questions you don't like, you come find me immediately. Understood? Understood, Wade confirmed. The sheriff placed his hat back on his head and left without another word, his boots heavy on the wooden steps outside. Wade stood by the window, watching him walk back toward the center of town, and felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken concerns. Mrs. Calloway returned to her mending, her needle moving in quick, practiced strokes that spoke of decades of experience. Levi resumed playing with his carved animals, but his movements were subdued now, the earlier animation gone. And Wade stood by the window, staring out at the settlement, at the handful of buildings that made up their little corner of civilization in the vast wilderness, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, the woman finally stirred. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement of her fingers, a faint twitch of her eyelids that Wade almost missed. He had been dozing in the chair beside the cot, exhausted from 3 nights of interrupted sleep, but something made him open his eyes, some instinct, some shift in the air. He leaned forward, suddenly alert, watching her closely. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and clouded with that milky film that spoke of permanent blindness. She blinked several times, her brow furrowing in confusion as her mind struggled to make sense of her surroundings. Then awareness seemed to crash over her like a wave, and panic flashed across her face. Her breathing quickened, becoming rapid and shallow. She tried to sit up, her hands scrabbling at the blankets covering her, her movements uncoordinated and desperate. "Easy," Wade said, his voice low and calm, the tone he used with spooked horses. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you. You're in Broken Ridge, and you're safe." The woman froze at the sound of his voice, her entire body going rigid. Her head turned toward him, her sightless eyes searching, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, rough from disuse and dehydration. "Who are you?" "My name is Wade Grant," he said, keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "This is Broken Ridge. It's a settlement in the Dakota Territory. My son and I found you 3 days ago in an abandoned wagon out on the prairie. You were in bad shape. Mrs. Calloway, she's the healer here. She's been taking care of you." The woman's hands moved to her throat, her fingers finding the locket with the desperate relief of someone confirming their most precious possession still exists. She clutched it tightly, her breathing still rapid and shallow. "How did I get here? How did I get to that wagon?" "And I was hoping you could tell me," Wade said gently, leaning forward slightly. "Do you remember anything?" "Anything at all?" But the woman was silent for a long moment. Her face was a mask of concentration, tension evident in every line, as if she were trying to pull memories from a deep, dark well that had long since run dry. Her fingers tightened on the locket until her knuckles went white. Finally she shook her head, and the gesture looked like defeat. "I remember pain, cold, being dragged across rough ground, voices shouting, men arguing about something, but nothing clear, nothing that makes sense. It's like trying to see through fog." Wade's jaw tightened, anger stirring in his chest at whoever had done this to her. "Do you know who did this to you? Did you see them?" A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. "See them? I'm blind. I haven't seen anything in 2 years." "But you might have recognized voices," Wade pressed gently, "or remembered names." Again she shook her head, and tears began to well in her clouded eyes, spilling over to track down her bruised cheeks. "I don't know. I can't remember. I don't remember anything before waking up in pain and darkness." Her voice broke. "I don't even know my own name, who I am, where I came from. It's all just gone." The words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Wade felt a pang of sympathy cut through him, sharp and unexpected. Whatever this woman had endured, it had stripped her of everything. Not just her freedom, not just her health, but her very identity. She was a blank slate, erased by trauma and violence. Levi, who had been standing quietly near the door, listening to every word with wide, solemn eyes, stepped forward. His small footsteps were soft on the wooden floor. "We can give you a name," he said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that reminded Wade so much of Martha, it made his chest ache. "Until you remember your real one." The woman turned her head toward the boy's voice, her expression softening slightly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "What would you call me?" Levi thought for a moment, his young face serious and thoughtful, in the way children are when they're trying to make an important decision. Then he looked at the window, where the last light of day was filtering through, casting a soft golden glow across the room that made the dust motes dance like tiny stars. The light had a warm amber quality, like honey or aged whiskey. "Hazel," he said finally, with the certainty of someone who has found exactly the right answer. "Like the color of the light. Warm and safe. That's what you should be." The woman's lips trembled. A single tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. "Hazel," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. "That's kind of you. That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in longer than I can remember." Wade felt something shift in his chest, some barrier he hadn't even known he'd erected beginning to crack. The name fit somehow. Hazel. It was simple, gentle, unassuming, just like the woman herself seemed to be. Beneath all the layers of trauma and fear and pain, Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway, carrying a bowl of warm broth that steamed gently in the cooling evening air. The smell of it, rich with herbs and vegetables, filled the cabin. "If you're done with introductions, she needs to eat. She's half-starved, and talking isn't going to put meat back on her bones." Wade stood and gestured for Mrs. Calloway to take his seat. The older woman sat down with a slight grunt and began spooning small amounts of broth into Hazel's mouth. The woman ate slowly, carefully, as if even this simple act required immense effort. She coughed once, and Mrs. Calloway paused, patient and practiced, before continuing. Over the next few days, Hazel's strength began to return, though her memories remained frustratingly absent. Wade and Levi took turns sitting with her, bringing her food 3 times a day, helping her move around the cabin as her legs slowly regained some strength. The first time she stood, she nearly collapsed, her legs shaking so badly Wade had to catch her. But she insisted on trying again the next day, and the day after that. Her determination evident in the set of her jaw, Mrs. Calloway continued to tend to her wounds with the same methodical care, changing bandages twice daily and applying salves that smelled of sage and something sharper to prevent infection. The rope burns on Hazel's wrists were healing, but slowly, and the scars would be permanent. Hazel was quiet, speaking only when spoken to, her voice always soft and uncertain. But Wade noticed small things, the kind of details that come from paying attention. The way her fingers would trace the edge of the locket when she was nervous, as if drawing comfort from its familiar weight and shape. The way she tilted her head when listening, her whole body focused on sound, as if trying to see the world through her ears, alone. The way she flinched at sudden noises, her body tensing automatically as if expecting a blow, her hands coming up defensively before she could stop herself. One afternoon, Wade found her sitting near the window, her face turned toward the sunlight streaming through the glass. Her expression was peaceful for the first time since she'd woken, the lines of pain and fear smoothed away temporarily. Levi was beside her, cross-legged on the floor, describing the world outside in careful, detailed sentences that painted pictures with words. "There's a hawk circling over the ridge," Levi was saying, his voice animated and full of life in a way it hadn't been since Martha died. "Pa says they hunt rabbits and prairie dogs. They can see a mouse from a mile up. Sometimes they just float on the wind, wings spread wide, like they're flying for the fun of it, not because they have to." Hazel smiled faintly, the expression transforming her bruised face. "That sounds beautiful." "It is," Levi said earnestly, nodding even though she couldn't see him. "I wish you could see it." I wish you could see everything. I can, Hazel said softly, reaching out to gently touch Levi's shoulder. Through your words, you paint pictures better than most people with eyes. You have a gift, Levi. Levi beamed, his whole face lighting up with pride and pleasure. Wade, watching from the doorway, felt a lump form in his throat. It had been so long since he had seen his son this happy, this alive. 3 years of grief seemed to lift slightly. Just for a moment, that evening as Wade was closing up the trading post, counting the day's meager earnings and organizing supplies for the next day, Sheriff Clayton returned. His expression was grim, the kind of look that meant bad news was coming. Wade felt his stomach tighten. Got word from Fort Ridgeway, the sheriff said without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries. A woman matching Hazel's description was reported missing about 2 months ago. Name was Grace Winters. She was a widow from a homestead about 30 miles north of here. Her husband died last spring in a riding accident, broke his neck when his horse spooked, and she was living alone after that. Neighbors said she disappeared one night without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no note, no indication she'd planned to leave. Just gone like she'd vanished into thin air. Wade's chest tightened, his breath catching. You think that's her? Could be, Clayton said, his tone cautious. Description matches. Age seems about right. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets complicated. The same report mentioned that Grace Winters had been having trouble with a man named Deckard Voss. He's a land speculator out of Cheyenne. Been buying up homesteads and small ranches all over this territory for the past 2 years. Paying bottom dollar and not taking no for an answer. Grace refused to sell. Multiple witnesses say she told Voss her husband had worked too hard for that land, had died on that land, and she'd be damned if she'd let some vulture from the city take it from her. So you think Voss took her? Wade's hands clenched into fists, anger rising hot and sharp. I think it's a possibility we can't ignore, Clayton said carefully. But I've got no proof, Wade, nothing concrete. And that's the problem. Deckard Voss is a powerful man. He's got connections that reach all the way to the territorial governor. He's got money, lawyers, and friends in high places. If he did this, proving it won't be easy. It might not even be possible. Wade's jaw tightened. So what do? We watch our backs, Clayton said seriously. And we keep her safe until we know more, until we can figure out what really happened and who's responsible. In the meantime, I'll keep digging. See what I can find out about Voss and his dealings. But you need to be prepared, Wade. If Voss finds out she's alive, if he finds out she's here, he'll come for her. And he won't come alone. Wade nodded slowly, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Appreciate the warning, Clayton. The sheriff tipped his hat and left, disappearing into the gathering dusk, his figure eventually swallowed by shadows. Wade stood in the doorway of the trading post, staring out at the darkening prairie, at the endless expanse of grass and sky. Somewhere out there, someone had tried to kill Hazel, had beaten her, bound her, and left her for dead in the middle of nowhere. And if they found out she was still alive, they might try again. This time, they might succeed. He returned to Mrs. Calloway's cabin, where Levi and Hazel were sitting by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate, peaceful atmosphere that felt almost sacred. Levi was reading aloud from an old book of frontier tales, his voice animated and full of expression, acting out different characters with enthusiasm. Hazel listened with a faint smile on her face, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, her head tilted in that characteristic way. Wade stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. For the first time in 3 years, his home felt alive again. It wasn't the same as it had been with Martha. It would never be the same. But it was something warm and fragile and desperately worth protecting. Levi looked up and saw his father standing there. "Pa, come listen. I'm at the part where the trapper fights the grizzly bear with nothing but a knife and his wits." Wade smiled faintly and crossed the room, settling into a chair near the fire. Its warmth seeped into his bones, driving away the chill that seemed to have settled permanently in his chest. Levi continued reading, his voice filling the cabin with life and adventure. And for a brief, precious moment, Wade allowed himself to forget about the danger lurking beyond the walls. He let himself simply be present here with his son and the woman they had saved. The woman who was bringing light back into their darkened world. But deep down, in the part of him that had survived years on the frontier by staying alert and cautious, he knew the peace wouldn't last. Storms were coming, dark clouds gathering on the horizon. And when they arrived, Wade would be ready. He had to be. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the first flakes of snow. Winter was here, and with it, the promise of trials yet to come. Winter came down hard on Broken Ridge. Within a week, snow blanketed the prairie in thick white drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling shutters and finding every crack in the wooden structures. Most of the settlement hunkered down, venturing out only when necessary to tend livestock or gather firewood. The world contracted to the size of warm rooms and crackling fires, to the sound of wind and the sight of endless white beyond frosted windows. Hazel's recovery continued slowly but steadily. Each morning, Wade would find her already awake, sitting near the window of Mrs. Calloway's cabin, with her face turned toward whatever weak sunlight managed to penetrate the heavy clouds. She was learning to navigate the small space with increasing confidence, her fingers trailing along the walls, memorizing the placement of furniture and the number of steps between the bed and the door. Mrs. Calloway had begun teaching her simple tasks, folding blankets, sorting dried herbs by smell and texture, small things that gave her purpose and occupied her restless hands. But it was with Levi that Hazel truly came alive. The boy spent every spare moment at her side, describing the world outside with such vivid detail that Wade sometimes wondered if his son had inherited some poet's soul from ancestors unknown. Levi would tell Hazel about the way snow caught on pine branches like cotton, about the tracks rabbits left in fresh powder, about the cardinal that visited the windowsill each morning looking for scattered seeds. And Hazel listened with a hunger that went beyond mere politeness. She absorbed every word, storing them away like precious treasures. One afternoon, Wade entered the cabin to find them sitting together near the stove. Levi was teaching Hazel a hand game, guiding her fingers through the motions. Their laughter, soft and genuine, stopped him in his tracks. It was the first time he had heard his son laugh, truly laugh, since Martha's death. The sound was like water in a desert, unexpected and life-giving. "What's this?" Wade asked, moving closer. Levi looked up, his face flushed with excitement. "I'm teaching Hazel cat's cradle. She's never played before. Can you believe that, Pa?" Hazel smiled, her clouded eyes directed toward Wade's voice. "I'm terrible at it. But Levi is very patient. She's getting better," Levi insisted loyally. "She almost got the Jacob's ladder on her last try." Wade watched them for a moment longer, something warming in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat. "I brought extra firewood. Storm's supposed to get worse tonight." As he stacked the wood near the stove, he became aware of Hazel's attention shifting to him. She tilted her head in that characteristic way, listening to the sounds of his movements. "You do a lot for us, Mr. Grant, for me. I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." "It's just Wade," he said, brushing bark from his hands. "And you don't owe me anything. Any decent person would have done the same." "I don't think that's true," Hazel said quietly. "Most people would have left me in that wagon, or turned me over to authorities without a second thought. You didn't have to bring me here, to let your son spend time with me, to protect me from whatever's out there." She paused, her hands fidgeting with the string still wrapped around her fingers. "Why did you, really?" Wade was silent for a long moment, considering the question. Why had he? It would have been easier to report the finding to Sheriff Clayton and wash his hands of the matter. Safer, certainly. But when he tried to imagine doing that, tried to picture leaving her in that wagon or handing her off to strangers, something in him recoiled. "My wife, Martha," he began slowly. "She used to say that we're all just one piece of bad luck away from being the person who needs help instead of the person giving it. She believed in showing mercy because we might need it ourselves someday." He looked at Hazel, really looked at her. "When I found you, I saw someone who'd had more than their share of bad luck. Seemed wrong to add to it." Hazel's expression softened, and Wade thought he saw tears gathering in her clouded eyes. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Wade said simply. Then, because the moment felt too heavy, he added, "Levi, why don't you help me bring in more supplies from the trading post? We'll need extra provisions if this storm keeps up." The boy jumped up eagerly, always ready for any task that made him feel useful and grown. As they bundled into coats and prepared to brave the cold, Hazel called out, "Be careful out there." The words were simple, ordinary, but they struck Wade with unexpected force. It had been 3 years since anyone had said those words to him. 3 years since anyone had cared whether he came back safely from an errand. He glanced back at Hazel, who sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward them, though she couldn't see. Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but understood. Outside, the wind cut like knives. Father and son bent their heads against it, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the trading post. The world was white and grey, the boundaries between earth and sky blurred into one continuous curtain of falling snow. They gathered what they needed quickly, working in the efficient silence of people who had done this many times before. "Pa," Levi said, as they loaded supplies into a canvas sack. "Do you think Hazel will remember who she is? Her real name, where she came from?" "Lucius," Wade paused in his work. "I don't know, son. Sometimes, when people go through something terrible, their minds protect them by forgetting. Might be her memory comes back, might be it doesn't. Would that be so bad?" Levi asked, his voice small. "If she didn't remember, she could stay here with us. She could be part of our family." Wade's chest tightened. He set down the sack and crouched to his son's level, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Levi, listen to me. Hazel's her own person. She's got a life somewhere, people who might be looking for her, a past that matters even if she can't remember it right now. We can help her, care for her, keep her safe, but we can't keep her like she's ours. That wouldn't be right." Levi's face fell. "But what if she wants to stay? What if there's nothing good in her past to go back to?" "Yours, then that'll be her choice to make," Wade said gently. "Not ours. You understand?" The boy nodded slowly, though Wade could see the disappointment in his eyes. They finished loading the supplies and made their way back to Mrs. Calloway's cabin, the wind pushing at their backs like insistent hands. That evening, as the storm reached its peak, Sheriff Clayton appeared at Wade's door. Snow covered him from head to foot, his beard frozen stiff with ice. Wade pulled him inside quickly, brushing snow from the man's shoulders. "What are you doing out in this?" Wade demanded. Clayton's expression was grim. "Had to come. Got news that couldn't wait." He glanced toward the corner where Levi was supposed to be sleeping, but the boy's pallet was empty. "He with her?" "At Mrs. Calloway's," Wade confirmed. "What news?" The sheriff moved closer to the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. "Deckard Voss is in the territory. Not here yet, but close. He's been making inquiries at Fort Ridgeway, asking about a missing woman. Blind woman, offering a substantial reward for information." Wade's blood ran cold. "How substantial?" $500. The amount hung in the air between them. $500 was more money than most people in Broken Ridge would see in 5 years. It was enough to tempt even honest men, enough to make desperate men do desperate things. "He's claiming she's his ward," Clayton continued. "Says she went missing from his property, that she's not right in the head, that he's worried about her safety. He's got papers, legal documents that say he's responsible for her care." "That's a lie," Wade said flatly. "Probably," Clayton agreed. "But it's a convincing lie, backed up with official-looking paperwork and a lot of money. If he comes here, if he presents those documents, I don't have legal grounds to refuse him. Not without proof that he's lying, not without Hazel being able to testify to what really happened." Wade's mind raced. "She can't remember what happened. She can't even remember her own name." "I know," Clayton said heavily. "That's why I'm here, to warn you. Voss is moving settlement to settlement, working his way through the territory. He'll reach Broken Ridge eventually, maybe in a week, maybe less, if the weather clears. When he does, you need to be ready. Ready for what? Wade asked, though he already knew the answer. Ready to make a choice, Clayton said bluntly. Turn her over or become a fugitive yourself. Because if you refuse to hand her over when he shows up with legal papers and a sheriff's warrant, that makes you guilty of obstruction. I won't be able to protect you. Wade was silent, his jaw working. Finally, he said, what would you do? If you were me? Clayton was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I'd like to think I'd do the right thing. But the right thing isn't always clear, Wade. Sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's just, and they're not always the same. He looked at Wade directly. But I'll tell you this. If Voss is willing to spend this much money and effort to find one blind woman, she knows something he doesn't want known, something worth killing for. After Clayton left, Wade sat alone in the dark cabin, listening to the wind howl. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. He thought about Hazel, about her terror when she'd first woken, about the rope burns on her wrists. He thought about Levi's laughter, the first real joy his son had shown in 3 years. He thought about Martha and what she would tell him to do. The answer came clearly. Martha would say to protect Hazel, no matter the cost. She would say that some things were worth the risk, worth the sacrifice. She had always believed that. The next morning, Wade moved Hazel to his own cabin. Mrs. Calloway protested, concerned about propriety and what people would say, but Wade cut her off. If Voss comes looking, he'll check the healer's cabin first. That's where any sick or injured person would be. He won't expect her to be in a widower's home. The older woman's eyes narrowed. And what about the talk? You know how people are, Wade. A man and a woman, alone under one roof, not married. They'll tear both your reputations to shreds. Let them talk, Wade said firmly. I'd rather deal with gossip than with Hazel being dragged away by a man who tried to kill her. In the end, Mrs. Calloway relented, though she made Wade promise to keep Levi there at all times as a chaperone of sorts. That afternoon, Wade and Levi helped Hazel make the short walk through the snow to their cabin. She moved carefully, one hand on Levi's shoulder, the other extended slightly in front of her. When they reached the door, Wade guided her inside. The cabin was simple, sparse even. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, 2 sleeping pallets in opposite corners, a rough wooden table with 3 chairs. But it was clean and warm, and the windows faced east to catch the morning sun. Wade had spent the morning preparing, cleaning and rearranging to make space. It's not much, Wade said, suddenly self-conscious about the plainness of his home. Hazel's fingers trailed along the back of a chair, learning its shape and position. It feels safe, she said simply. That's more than enough. They established a routine quickly. Wade gave Hazel his sleeping pallet near the warmth of the fireplace and took the colder spot near the door himself. Levi kept his corner, thrilled to have Hazel so close. Each morning, Wade would wake early to stoke the fire and prepare a simple breakfast. Hazel, despite her blindness, insisted on helping. She learned to crack eggs by sound, to judge when water was boiling by the intensity of the bubbling, to slice bread by counting uniform motions. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Levi would read aloud. Sometimes Wade would carve, while Hazel asked questions about Broken Ridge, about the people, about the land. She never asked about her past, never pushed to know what Wade and the sheriff had discussed. It was as if she had accepted her new life and decided not to look back. One night, about a week after she'd moved in, Wade woke to the sound of quiet sobbing. He sat up carefully, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Hazel was sitting on her pallet, her knees drawn up, her face buried in her hands. She was trying to cry silently, but the shaking of her shoulders gave her away. Wade hesitated, unsure whether to pretend he hadn't heard or to acknowledge her pain. Finally, he stood and moved quietly across the room. "Hazel," he said softly. She stiffened, her hands falling away from her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Wade lied gently. He lowered himself to sit on the floor near her pallet, keeping a respectful distance. "Bad dreams?" Hazel nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I keep seeing things. Not memories exactly. More like feelings, fear, pain, running. But I can't see faces, can't hear voices clearly enough to recognize them. It's like being haunted by ghosts I should know, but don't. Wade was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's your mind's way of protecting you. Maybe when you're strong enough, the memories will come back. What if I don't want them back? Hazel whispered. What if remembering means losing this? Losing the peace I've found here? Losing Levi's laughter and your kindness and the feeling of being safe for the first time in God knows how long. The vulnerability in her voice, the raw honesty made Wade's chest ache. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. Whatever comes, whatever you remember or don't remember, you'll face it. And you won't face it alone. Hazel's grip tightened on his hand. Why are you doing this? You could turn me over to Voss when he comes. Collect the reward. $500 would change your life. Wade's jaw tightened. Some things can't be bought, and some things aren't worth the price. He paused, then added quietly, when Martha was dying in those last hours, she made me promise something. She said, Wade, don't let this world make you hard. Don't let grief turn you into stone. Promise me you'll stay human, stay kind, no matter what. I promised her. And I meant it. Tears spilled down Hazel's cheeks again, but they were different now. Not tears of fear or pain, but of something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. She was right to trust you with that promise. They sat in the darkness for a while longer, hands clasped, neither speaking. Finally, Hazel's breathing evened out, and Wade realized she had fallen back asleep, sitting up. Carefully, he eased her back onto the pallet and pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. As he returned to his own corner, he noticed Levi watching from his pallet, eyes gleaming in the darkness. Pa, the boy whispered, are we going to keep her safe? No matter what. Wade settled back onto his own blankets. Yes, son, no matter what, even if the bad men come. And even then, Levi was quiet for a moment. Then so softly Wade almost missed it. Good, because I think she's supposed to be here, with us. Wade didn't answer, but as he lay in the darkness, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of his small household, he couldn't shake the feeling that his son might be right. That somehow, impossibly, finding Hazel in that broken wagon hadn't been chance at all. It had been fate, offering them all a second chance at something they thought they'd lost forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The storm finally broke 3 days later. The sun emerged pale but persistent, and the temperature rose just enough to make travel possible again. That afternoon, a stranger rode into Broken Ridge. He was well-dressed, his horse expensive, his manner confident. He stopped first at the sheriff's office. Wade, watching from the trading post window, felt his blood turn to ice. He knew with absolute certainty that Deckard Voss had arrived. Deckard Voss was not what Wade expected. He had imagined a brutish man, scarred and rough, someone whose cruelty would be written plainly across his features. Instead, Voss was refined, almost genteel. He wore a tailored black coat with a silk vest beneath, polished boots that had never seen hard labor, and a wide-brimmed hat that sat at a precise angle. His face was clean-shaven, his dark hair slicked back with pomade. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth were straight and white. He looked like a banker or a lawyer, someone who dealt in contracts and handshakes, not violence and abduction. But Wade saw something else beneath the polish. He saw it in the way Voss's eyes moved constantly, calculating and assessing everyone and everything around him. He saw it in the cold precision of his gestures, the way his hand never strayed far from the pistol holstered at his hip. This was a dangerous man, made more dangerous by his ability to hide his true nature behind a mask of civility. From the trading post window, Wade watched Voss emerge from the sheriff's office with Clayton. The two men stood in the street conversing. Voss gestured expansively, while Clayton's posture remained rigid, uncomfortable. After several minutes, they shook hands. and Voss turned to survey the settlement. His gaze swept across the buildings methodically, lingering on each structure, as if cataloguing them. When his eyes passed over the trading post, Wade stepped back from the window instinctively, though he knew he hadn't been seen. He needed to warn Hazel. He locked the trading post door, hung the closed sign, and hurried through the snow-packed streets toward his cabin. His breath came in visible puffs, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he burst through the door, he found Hazel and Levi sitting at the table, working on another string game. "He's here," Wade said without preamble. "Voss, he's at the sheriff's office right now." Hazel's face went pale. Her hands, which had been moving confidently through the string pattern, suddenly froze. "Are you certain?" "I saw him myself. Fits the description Clayton gave us." Wade moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. "Well-dressed, expensive horse, carries himself like a man used to getting what he wants." Levi looked between his father and Hazel, confusion and fear mixing on his young face. "What do we do, Pa?" Wade's mind raced through possibilities. They could run, try to make it to Fort Ridgeway before Voss found them. But travel in winter was deadly, and Hazel's blindness would slow them down considerably. They could hide her somewhere in the settlement, but Broken Ridge was small, and $500 would loosen many tongues. Or they could stand their ground, refuse to cooperate, and hope the law would protect them. "We do nothing different," Wade said finally, forcing his voice to remain calm. "We go about our business like normal." Hazel stays inside, away from windows. "Levi, you don't mention her to anyone, understand? Not even people you trust." The boy nodded solemnly. "I won't say nothing, Pa, I promise." "Anything," Wade corrected automatically, then softened his tone. "I know you won't, son. You're brave, just like your mama was." Hazel stood, her hand finding the back of the chair for support. "Wade, I won't let you risk everything for me. If he has legal papers, if he has the sheriff's support, maybe it's better if I just go with him. Maybe that's the only way to keep you and Levi safe." "No," Wade said sharply. The word came out harder than he intended. He crossed the room to stand before her. "You're not going anywhere with that man. Whatever he did to you before, he'll do again. Probably worse, since you escaped once. But you heard what Sheriff Clayton said. You could become a fugitive. You could lose everything." Hazel's voice cracked. "I'm not worth that." Wade reached out and gently took her shoulders. "That's not your decision to make. And you're wrong. You are worth it." The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but he realized they were true. Somewhere in the past weeks, Hazel had become more than just a stranger he'd rescued. She had become part of his life, part of his family, part of the small circle of people he would protect at any cost. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Wade's hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Get in the back corner," he whispered to Hazel. "Levi, stand in front of her." They moved quickly, Levi guiding Hazel to the darkest corner of the cabin where the shadows were deepest. Wade took down the rifle, checked that it was loaded, and moved to the door. "Who is it?" "Sheriff Clayton," came the familiar voice. "Need to talk to you, Wade. It's important." Wade opened the door cautiously. Clayton stood on the porch, his expression troubled. Behind him, about 20 yards back, stood Deckard Voss, watching with keen interest. Wade's grip tightened on the rifle. "Can I come in?" Clayton asked quietly. Wade stepped aside, allowing the sheriff to enter, but he left the door open, a clear message that Voss was not welcome. Clayton removed his hat, his eyes immediately finding Hazel in the corner. He nodded to her once, a gesture of acknowledgement, then turned to Wade. "Voss has papers," Clayton said without preamble. "Legal documents signed by a judge in Cheyenne. They name him as guardian to a woman called Grace Winters, who's described as mentally unsound and in need of constant care. The description matches Hazel in every particular. Age, height, the blindness, even the locket." "The locket?" Wade's blood ran cold. How could Voss know about the locket unless he'd been the one who put her in that wagon? It's listed in the documents as identifying property. "Silver locket with a bird engraving, family heirloom." Clayton's expression was pained. "Wade, I don't like this any more than you do." But legally, I have to tell you that if the woman in this cabin is Grace Winters, she has to be turned over to her legal guardian." "I'm not Grace Winters," Hazel said suddenly, her voice stronger than Wade had ever heard it. She stepped forward, Levi still close beside her. "I don't know who Grace Winters is, but it's not me." Clayton looked at her with something like pity in his eyes. "Ma'am, with all respect, you don't remember your name. You said so yourself. You can't be certain you're not Grace Winters." "I can be certain I'm not that man's ward," Hazel said firmly. "I can be certain that whoever did this to me," she held up her scarred wrists, "intended me to die. I can be certain that if I go with him, I will die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And this time, there won't be a good man and his son to find me." Voss's voice came from the doorway, smooth and cultured. "How dramatic. May I enter, Sheriff? Since we're discussing my property, I feel I should be part of the conversation." Wade raised the rifle slightly. "This is my home." "You're not invited." Voss smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. My apologies for the presumption. I'm Deckard Voss, Mr. Grant. I believe you've found someone who belongs to me, and I've come to take her home." "She's not property," Wade said coldly. "And she's not going anywhere." "I'm afraid the law disagrees with you," Voss replied, his tone remaining pleasant despite the threat implicit in his words. "Grace is a troubled woman who suffered a mental breakdown after her husband's tragic death. She wandered away from my estate where she was receiving care. I've been searching for her for months, terribly worried for her safety." He looked past Wade to Hazel. "Grace, dear, I'm so relieved to have found you. You gave us all quite a scare." "My name is Hazel," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Wade could see in her hands. "I don't know you. The poor thing doesn't remember," Voss said to Clayton, shaking his head sadly. "The trauma of her husband's death, combined with her blindness, it's been too much for her fragile mind. That's precisely why she needs professional care, not to be left in the hands of strangers who, however well-meaning, are not equipped to handle her condition." Wade stepped forward, putting himself between Voss and Hazel. "Get off my property." "You Wade," Clayton said warningly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "He's lying," Wade said, not taking his eyes off Voss. "Everything about this is a lie. Those papers are forgeries. His story is fiction. And if you hand her over, you'll be signing her death warrant." "That's quite an accusation," Voss said, his pleasant mask slipping slightly. A hardness entered his voice. "Do you have any proof of these claims? Any evidence at all that I've done anything wrong? Because I have legal documents, signed and sealed." "What do you have?" "The word of a confused woman who doesn't even know her own name." The silence that followed was crushing. Wade knew Voss was right. They had no proof, nothing concrete to counter the official-looking papers the man carried. It was his word against legal documents, and the law would always side with the documents. "I have proof," Levi said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at the boy, who stood with his small fists clenched at his sides. "The locket. Open it." Voss's expression flickered just for a moment before the pleasant mask returned. "What?" "The locket around Hazel's neck," Levi continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Your papers say it's a family heirloom, right? That means you should know what's inside it. So tell us, what's in the locket?" Wade felt a surge of pride in his son. It was a brilliant move. If Voss truly was Grace Winters' guardian, if the locket truly belonged to her, he would know its contents. Voss hesitated, his calculating eyes moving from Levi to Hazel to the locket visible at her throat. A photograph, of course, of Grace's late husband. "Open it," Levi insisted, looking at Hazel. "Show them." Hazel's trembling fingers found the locket. She fumbled with the clasp for a moment before it opened. Wade moved closer to see. Inside was indeed a photograph, but it was faded almost beyond recognition. The image showed a young woman, not a man. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's not a man," Wade said, turning to Voss. "You said it was a photograph of her husband." Voss's jaw tightened. "I must have been mistaken. It's been years since I saw inside the locket. Perhaps it's a photograph of Grace's mother or a sister." The specific contents are irrelevant. The locket itself is the identifying property listed in the documents. You've never seen inside this locket, Hazel said quietly. Because it's not yours. Because I'm not Grace Winters. Because everything you've said is a lie. Enough of this, Voss snapped, his cultured facade cracking further. He turned to Clayton. Sheriff, are you going to enforce the law or not? I have legal papers. I have a judge's signature. That woman is my ward, and I'm taking her with me now. Clayton looked torn, his hand resting on his own pistol. Wade, I don't want to do this, but I don't have a choice. The law is the law. Then the law is wrong, Wade said flatly. He raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone specifically, but making his position clear. She stays here. You're making a mistake, Voss said, his voice now cold and hard. A very serious mistake. I came here legally, properly, with all the right documentation. You're choosing to become a criminal over a woman you barely know. I know enough, Wade replied. I know she was beaten and left to die. I know those rope burns on her wrists didn't come from someone trying to help her. I know you're a liar and probably a murderer, and I know you're not taking her anywhere. Voss stared at Wade for a long moment, and in that stare, Wade saw the truth. He saw cold calculation, murderous intent, and absolute certainty. This man would not give up. He would not walk away. He would get what he came for, one way or another. Very well, Voss said finally. Sheriff, I'll be staying at the boarding house for the next few days, while I arrange for federal marshals to come handle this situation properly. Since Mr. Grant is unwilling to cooperate with local law enforcement, perhaps federal authorities will be more persuasive. He smiled coldly at Wade. Enjoy your last few days of freedom, Mr. Grant. And Grace, I'll see you very soon. He turned and walked away, his expensive boots crunching in the snow. Clayton lingered for a moment, his expression apologetic. Wade, he's serious. If he brings in federal marshals with those documents, I won't be able to protect you. They'll take her by force if necessary, and they'll arrest you for obstruction. I understand, Wade said quietly. Do you? Clayton leaned closer, lowering his voice. Because I'm not sure you do. You'll lose everything. Your home, your business, possibly your freedom. They might even take Levi away, put him in an orphanage while you're in prison. Is she really worth all that? Wade looked back at Hazel, standing in the shadows with Levi beside her, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. He thought about the past weeks, about laughter returning to his home, about feeling alive again instead of just existing. He thought about Martha and the promise he'd made her. Yes, Wade said simply. She is. Clayton sighed heavily. Then God help you, because I can't. He put his hat back on and left, closing the door quietly behind him. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Finally, Hazel spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You should let me go. Before it's too late. Before you lose everything. Wade set the rifle back above the fireplace and turned to face her. It's already too late. The moment I found you in that wagon, the moment I brought you here, it was too late. And I wouldn't change it even if I could. Tears spilled down Hazel's cheeks. Why? Why would you risk so much for someone like me? Wade crossed the room and gently took her hands in his. Because you're not someone like you. You're just you. You're the woman who makes my son laugh again. You're the person who brought warmth back into this cold house. You're brave and kind and worth fighting for. He paused, then added quietly, and because somewhere along the way, I started caring about you. More than I probably should. The confession hung in the air between them. Hazel's breath caught, her clouded eyes searching as if she could see his face. Wade, I don't even know who I am. I can't remember my past. I might be married, might have children somewhere. I might be someone completely different from who you think I am. Then we'll figure it out together, Wade said. Whatever the truth is, we'll face it. But we'll do it here, safe, not in the hands of a man who wants you dead. Levi moved to stand beside them, taking both Wade's hand and Hazel's. We're a family, he said, with the absolute certainty of a child. Families don't give up on each other. Mama taught me that. Wade felt something break open in his chest, some barrier he'd built after Martha's death finally crumbling. He pulled both Levi and Hazel into an embrace, holding them close. "You're right, son. We're a family, and we protect our own." Outside, the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. In the boarding house across the settlement, Deckard Voss stood at his window, watching Wade's cabin with cold, calculating eyes. He sipped expensive whiskey and smiled to himself. Let them have their moment, their little declaration of defiance. It wouldn't matter. In 3 days, the federal marshals would arrive. And then Grace Winters, or Hazel, or whatever name she wanted to call herself, would be his again. But what Voss didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that the people of Broken Ridge had been watching too. They had seen his expensive clothes and polished manners. They had heard his smooth words and legal claims, and something about it all felt wrong. Mrs. Calloway, standing in her doorway, remembered the rope burns on Hazel's wrists. Old Henson, the trapper, recalled how terrified the woman had been when she first woke. Mrs. Henderson, despite her love of gossip, thought about how gentle and kind Hazel had been with Levi, one by one, quietly, without grand declarations. The people of Broken Ridge began to make a choice, not about law or papers or official documents, but about something simpler and more fundamental, about right and wrong, about protecting one of their own. The storm was coming, but this time Wade wouldn't face it alone. The federal marshals arrived on the 3rd day, just as Voss had promised. 2 of them, hard-faced men with badges and rifles, accompanied by a thin clerk carrying a leather satchel full of papers. They rode into Broken Ridge at midday, their horses kicking up clouds of snow and frozen mud. The settlement seemed to hold its breath as they dismounted outside the sheriff's office. Wade watched from the trading post window, his stomach tight with dread. Beside him stood Mrs. Calloway, old Henson, and a half-dozen other townspeople who had quietly gathered when word spread that the marshals were coming. No one spoke. They simply watched and waited. Sheriff Clayton emerged from his office to meet the marshals. Even from a distance, Wade could see the reluctance in Clayton's posture, the way his shoulders sagged as he shook hands with the federal men. They spoke for several minutes, the clerk producing documents from his satchel. Clayton examined them, his face growing grimmer with each page he turned. Then Voss appeared, stepping out from the boarding house like an actor taking the stage. He was smiling, confident, already tasting his victory. He joined the group, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Wade couldn't hear the words, but he could imagine them. More lies, more manipulation, more of that smooth, cultured voice painting Hazel as a helpless invalid who needed to be rescued from her own confusion. "They're coming," Mrs. Calloway said quietly. "You need to be ready, Wade." Wade nodded, not taking his eyes off the group in the street. "I am." "Ready to lose everything?" Henson asked bluntly. "Because that's what's about to happen, boy. Those federal men don't care about what's right. They care about what's legal. And legal is on that bastard's side." "Maybe," Wade said, "but I made my choice." The group began moving toward Wade's cabin. Clayton led the way, followed by the 2 marshals, then Voss and the clerk. They moved with purpose, their boots crunching in the packed snow. Wade felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The moment everything would either hold together or fall completely apart, he left the trading post and walked quickly to his cabin, arriving just moments before the official party. Inside, Hazel sat at the table with Levi beside her. She had heard them coming, her head tilted in that listening posture Wade had come to know so well. Her hand rested on the locket at her throat. "They're here," Wade said unnecessarily. "Stay calm. Let me do the talking." The knock came hard and official. Wade opened the door to find the entire group assembled on his porch. Clayton stood at the front, his expression apologetic and resigned. Behind him, the 2 federal marshals looked impatient, eager to complete their task and be on their way. Voss stood to the side, that infuriating smile still plastered on his face. "Wade Grant," the taller marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "I'm Marshal Thomas Blackwood. This is Marshal James Pike. We have a federal warrant for the return of one Grace Winters to the custody of her legal guardian, Deckard Voss. We're informed she's residing in this cabin." "There's no Grace Winters here," Wade said firmly. Just my family. Mr. Grant, we don't want any trouble, Pike said, his hand resting casually on his pistol. We've reviewed the documentation. Everything is in order. Mr. Voss has legal custody, and we're authorized to return the woman to his care. You can cooperate, or we can arrest you for obstruction and take her anyway. Your choice. Wade's jaw tightened. He was out of moves, out of arguments. The law, unjust as it was, had arrived with guns and papers, and he had nothing to counter it with except his own conviction that this was wrong. Then Hazel stood. She moved carefully around the table, one hand trailing along its edge for guidance, until she stood beside Wade. I'll go, she said quietly. I won't let Wade and Levi suffer for protecting me. No, Levi cried out, grabbing her arm. You can't. You said we're a family. Families don't give up. Sometimes, Hazel said gently, kneeling to the boy's level, families protect each other by making hard choices. She touched his face tenderly, her fingers tracing his features as if memorizing them. You gave me something precious, Levi. You gave me a name and kindness and the feeling of being safe. I'll carry that with me always. How touching, Voss said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Come along, Grace. Let's get you home where you belong. Hazel stood and turned toward Voss's voice. For a moment, Wade thought she would simply walk out, surrender to the inevitable. But then something changed in her expression. Her head tilted differently, her entire body going rigid. Her hand flew to her mouth. That voice, she whispered. I know that voice. Everyone froze. Voss's smile faltered. Of course you know my voice, Grace. I've been caring for you for months. No, Hazel said, her voice growing stronger. Not from care. From fear, from darkness, from cold. Her breathing quickened, memories clearly flooding back. You were there, in the wagon. You were one of the men who put me there. The poor woman is confused, Voss said quickly, looking at the marshals. This is exactly why she needs professional care. She's having delusions, mixing reality with fantasy. You said something, Hazel continued, her face pale but determined, right before you left me to die. You said, should have sold when you had the chance, you stubborn bitch. Now your land will go to the territory, and I'll buy it for pennies. I remember now. I remember everything. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Wade saw Voss's expression change, saw the mask slip completely for just a moment before he regained control. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it. That's an interesting story, Voss said, his voice tight. But it's just that. A story from a confused mind. Marshals, if we could proceed— Wait, Marshal Blackwood said, holding up a hand. He stepped closer to Hazel, studying her face intently. You say you remember being left in a wagon to die? By this man? Yes, Hazel said firmly. I couldn't see his face, but I know his voice. And I remember what he said. He wanted my land, my husband's homestead. He'd been pressuring me to sell for months, threatening me, telling me a blind widow had no business trying to run a farm alone. When I refused, he had his men kidnap me one night. They tied me up, beat me, and left me in that wagon to die of exposure. They thought no one would ever find me. This is absurd, Voss protested. She's making this up, trying to avoid returning to proper care. You can't possibly believe— What I believe, Blackwood interrupted, his eyes cold, is that we need to investigate these allegations properly. If what she says is true, we're dealing with attempted murder, not a guardianship dispute. He turned to Voss. Mr. Voss, I'm going to need you to come with us while we sort this out. On what grounds? Voss demanded, his cultured facade cracking completely now. Based on the ravings of a blind woman with memory problems? I have legal documents. I have a judge's signature. You can't possibly— I can and I will, Blackwood said firmly. Those documents claim you're her guardian. But if you're actually her attacker, then those documents are fraudulent. That makes this a federal crime. He looked at Pike. Take him. Voss's hand moved toward his pistol, but Pike was faster. The marshal had his gun drawn and pointed at Voss's chest before the man could clear leather. Don't even think about it, Pike growled. For a moment Voss looked like he might fight anyway. His eyes darted around, calculating odds, looking for escape routes. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "This isn't over," he said coldly, staring at Hazel. "I have powerful friends, lawyers, resources you can't imagine. I'll be free before the week is out, and when you are, you'll be answering to a federal judge," Blackwood said. "Not threatening blind women in frontier settlements," he gestured to Pike. "Get him out of here." As the marshals led Voss away in handcuffs, the man's protests and threats echoing down the street, Wade felt something release in his chest. It wasn't over, not completely. There would be trials, testimonies, legal battles. But for now, Hazel was safe. Sheriff Clayton lingered on the porch, shaking his head in amazement. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen you do, Wade. Could have gone very differently." "But it didn't," Wade said simply. Clayton nodded slowly. "No, it didn't." He looked at Hazel with newfound respect. "Ma'am, you'll need to make a formal statement, and we'll need to verify your identity, your ownership of that homestead Voss was after. But for now, you're free to stay here. No one's going to force you anywhere." "Thank you, Sheriff," Hazel said quietly. After Clayton left, Wade closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had been keeping him upright drained away, leaving him shaky and weak. Levi ran to Hazel, throwing his arms around her waist. "You remembered," the boy said, his voice muffled against her. "You got your memory back." Hazel held him close, tears streaming down her face. "Not all of it. Just pieces, but enough. Enough to know that I'm Grace Winters, and I have a homestead north of here, and a life I thought I'd lost forever." She raised her head toward Wade. "And enough to know that you saved me. Both of you. You gave me more than safety. You gave me family." Over the following weeks, the full story emerged. Grace Winters, widowed and blind but fiercely independent, had refused to sell her late husband's land to Deckard Voss. Voss, who had been systematically acquiring homesteads throughout the territory through intimidation and fraud, saw her refusal as a personal affront. He had arranged for her abduction, planning to make it look like she had simply wandered off in her confused state and died of exposure. With her dead and no heirs, the land would revert to the territory, and Voss could purchase it cheaply at auction. But he hadn't counted on Wade and Levi finding her, hadn't anticipated that a widower and his son would risk everything to protect a stranger. And he certainly hadn't expected Grace to recover her memory at the exact moment when it mattered most. The trial, when it came, was swift. Multiple witnesses came forward with stories of Voss's intimidation tactics. The men who had actually carried out the kidnapping were found and, facing their own charges, quickly testified against their employer. Voss's expensive lawyers delayed proceedings for a while, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Grace's homestead was restored to her, along with compensation for her suffering. She could have returned to it, could have reclaimed her old life, but she didn't. One evening, as spring began to break winter's grip on the Dakota territory, Grace sat with Wade on his porch. They had been sitting in comfortable silence, watching Levi play in the yard, when she finally spoke. "I went to see the homestead yesterday," she said. "Mrs. Calloway took me in her wagon." Wade's heart sank. "And it's beautiful," Grace said, "or it was once. Now it's just empty. The house needs repairs, the fences are falling down, the fields are overgrown." She paused. It felt like visiting a grave, like paying respects to a life that's already gone. "What are you saying?" Wade asked quietly. Grace turned toward him, her clouded eyes somehow still expressive. "I'm saying that place isn't my home anymore. This is here, with you and Levi, if you'll have me." Wade felt emotion well up in his throat. "Grace, I know it's complicated," she continued. "I know people will talk. A widower and a widow living under one roof. But I don't care about that. These past months, you've given me something I thought I'd never have again. Hope, purpose, love." She reached out, her hand finding his. "I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. I'm just asking if I can stay, if we can build something together, a real family." Wade looked at her hand in his, then at Levi playing in the yard, then back at Grace. He thought about Martha and the promise he'd made her. To stay human, to stay kind, to not let grief turn him into stone. He had kept that promise, and in doing so, he had found something he never expected. "You already are family," he said. "Both of you. You and Levi. You're the reason I wake up in the morning feeling something other than empty." He squeezed her hand gently. "Stay, please, stay forever." Grace smiled, and it transformed her entire face. Forever sounds perfect. They sat together as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Levi, seeing them on the porch, ran over and squeezed between them, taking both their hands. "Are we really a family now?" he asked. "A real one?" "We always were," Wade said, pulling his son close. "From the moment you whispered, 'Pa, it's Mama's locket,' we were family. We just didn't know it yet." "The locket," Grace said softly, her fingers moving to touch it. "I never told you the story behind it. Would you like to hear?" "Yes," Levi said eagerly. Grace opened the locket carefully. "The woman in the photograph is my grandmother. She came to America alone, fleeing a life she didn't choose in England. She had nothing but this locket and her courage. She built a life here, found love, raised a family. She gave this to my mother, who gave it to me. It's a symbol of strength, of women who refused to be victims, who chose their own paths, no matter how difficult." She closed the locket. "When I was in that wagon dying, I held on to this and thought of her. Thought of all the women in my family who had survived impossible things. That's what kept me alive long enough for you to find me." "Then it's a magic locket," Levi decided. "Like in the fairy tales." Grace laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "Maybe it is, sweetheart. Maybe it is." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the three of them sat together on the porch of the small cabin in Broken Ridge. They were an unlikely family, forged not by blood but by choice, by courage, by refusing to accept that circumstances defined their futures. They had all lost so much, suffered so deeply. But they had found each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you never knew you were searching for. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of spring, of new beginnings, of second chances. And in a small trading settlement in the Dakota Territory, three souls who had been broken found themselves whole again. Together they were home. 2 years had passed since the federal marshals led Deckard Voss away in chains. 2 years since Grace Winters chose to stay in Broken Ridge, rather than return to the lonely homestead where her husband had died. 2 years that had transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone in the small Dakota settlement. The trading post had expanded. What had once been a modest single-room structure now boasted a full second story and a storage barn out back. Wade had used the compensation money from Grace's trial settlement wisely, investing in inventory and improvements. The post now carried everything from farming equipment to fine fabrics, serving not just Broken Ridge, but 3 neighboring settlements as well. Travelers passing through would often remark that they'd never seen such a well-stocked store this far from civilization. But the real change wasn't in the building or the business. It was in the people who ran it. Grace stood behind the counter, her fingers moving with practiced confidence over the bolts of fabric a customer had requested. She had learned to identify materials by texture alone, could tell cotton from wool, from silk with a single touch. Her fingers traced the weave, counted threads, assessed quality, with an expertise that often surprised newcomers who didn't realize she was blind. "This one is a fine cotton calico," she said, her voice warm and assured. "Tight weave will hold up well to washing. The pattern is small flowers, blue on white. My son tells me it's quite fashionable back east." She smiled. "Though I'm not sure an 8-year-old boy is the most reliable source for fashion advice." Mrs. Henderson, the customer in question, laughed. The same woman who had once gossiped suspiciously about the mysterious stranger now came to Grace for advice on everything from fabric to recipes. "I'll take 3 yards," she said, "and you're right to be skeptical. My husband thinks anything that isn't work clothes is fashionable." Grace measured out the fabric with a specialized tool Wade had fashioned for her, a wooden ruler with notches she could feel. She cut with scissors along a straight edge, her movements sure and economical. "Will there be anything else today?" "Or just the usual staples. Flour, sugar, salt." Mrs. Henderson leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "And Grace, I wanted to say before I forget." "Thank you." Grace tilted her head. "For what?" "For what you did yesterday, with the Miller girl." Mrs. Henderson's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah came home talking about how kind you were, how you didn't treat her like she was stupid just because she's slow with her letters. Her own teacher had given up on her, said she'd never learn to read properly. But you sat with her for 2 hours, teaching her to recognize words by their sounds and shapes. She read an entire sentence by herself last night. Her father cried." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. Teaching had become one of her greatest joys. What had started as helping Levi with his lessons had grown into something more. Children from all over Broken Ridge now came to the trading post after school, and Grace would work with them, finding ways to help each one learn despite their individual struggles. Her blindness, rather than being a hindrance, had given her unique insight into different ways of understanding the world. "Sarah's a bright girl," Grace said gently. "She just needed someone to show her that reading isn't about seeing letters. It's about hearing the music in words." Once she understood that, everything else followed. After Mrs. Henderson left, Grace moved through the store, straightening items, taking inventory by touch. She knew the location of every product, could navigate the space as easily as someone with sight. This was her domain, her contribution to the life she and Wade had built together. The door opened with its characteristic creak, and Grace smiled before the person even spoke. She knew that particular rhythm of footsteps, the slight drag of the left boot that Wade kept meaning to get resoled, but never did. "You're back early," she said. "I wasn't expecting you until sunset." Wade crossed the room, and she felt his presence before he touched her, that particular warmth that always preceded him. His hands found her waist gently. "Finished the delivery faster than expected. Thought I'd come back and see if my beautiful wife needed any help with the store." Grace laughed softly. They had married 6 months ago, a simple ceremony in the settlement's small church with the entire town in attendance. Sheriff Clayton had given Grace away, and Levi had stood as Wade's best man, so proud in his new suit that he'd barely been able to stop grinning. It had been perfect, intimate, and joyful. A celebration not just of their union, but of everything they had survived to reach that moment. "Your beautiful wife has everything under control," Grace said, leaning back against Wade's chest. Though she wouldn't mind if her handsome husband stayed close anyway, Wade pressed a kiss to her temple. "Where's Levi?" "At the schoolhouse. Miss Peterson asked if he could help the younger children with their arithmetic. Apparently, our son has a gift for explaining numbers in ways that make sense to 8-year-olds. Wade chuckled. "He gets that from you. The patience, the ability to break things down until they're simple." He paused. "Though I suppose he gets his stubbornness from both of us." "Stubbornness," Grace said thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling it now? I seem to recall you calling it pig-headed determination when I insisted on learning to run the register by myself." "That was before I knew you'd end up being better at it than I ever was," Wade admitted. "Now I just call it brilliance." They stood together in the quiet store, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light. These moments of peace, of simple domestic happiness, still felt miraculous to Grace. There were mornings when she woke up and had to remind herself that this was real, that she truly had found a home. A family, a life worth living. The door opened again, and this time multiple sets of footsteps entered. Grace recognized them immediately, Levi's quick, light steps and slower, heavier ones that belonged to someone older. "Ma, Pa," Levi called out excitedly. "Look who I found on the way back from school." "Not found, exactly," came a warm, elderly voice. "More like I was waiting to ambush you, young man." Grace's breath caught. "Judge Morrison?" "The very same," the judge confirmed. Grace heard him moving closer, his cane tapping against the floorboards. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, Mrs. Grant. I was passing through the territory on circuit business and thought I'd stop by to see how you were faring." Judge Eli Morrison had presided over Deckard Voss's trial. He was a stern man with a reputation for fairness and an absolute intolerance for corruption. He had listened to Grace's testimony, heard the evidence, and delivered a verdict that had sent shockwaves through the territory's land speculation community. More than that, he had personally overseen the return of Grace's homestead and the compensation she received. "We're doing well, Your Honor," Wade said, stepping forward to shake the judge's hand. "Very well indeed. Can we offer you coffee? Something to eat?" "Coffee would be most welcome," Morrison replied. "It's been a long ride." They settled in the small sitting area Wade had created near the store's stove, a cozy space with chairs and a table where customers could rest and chat. Grace prepared the coffee, her movements efficient and sure, while Levi peppered the judge with questions about his travels. "I have to confess," Morrison said after taking a long sip of coffee, "I had an ulterior motive for this visit beyond simple courtesy." He set down his cup carefully. "Mrs. Grant, I've been hearing remarkable things about the work you've been doing with the children here, teaching them, helping them learn in ways their regular schooling hasn't managed." Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. "It's nothing formal, Your Honor. Just a few hours here and there, helping where I can." "Don't undersell yourself," Morrison said firmly. "I spoke with several parents before coming here. The Henderson girl, Sarah, who couldn't read a year ago, is now at the top of her class. The Jacobson boy, who everyone said was too simple for schooling, can now do mathematical calculations that astound his teacher. The Chen family's daughter, who spoke barely any English, is now helping translate for other immigrant families." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Grant, you have a gift, and I'm here to ask if you'd be willing to use it on a larger scale." Grace's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. The territorial government is establishing a new school in Fort Ridgeway," Morrison explained. "Not a regular school, but one specifically designed for children who struggle in traditional educational settings. Children with disabilities, children from non-English speaking families, children who learn differently than their peers. We need a headmistress, someone who understands that there are many paths to knowledge, not just one." He paused meaningfully. "We need you." The words hung in the air. Grace felt Wade's hand find hers, squeezing gently. Levi had gone silent, his young face serious, as he processed what this might mean. "Your Honor, I'm honored," Grace said slowly, "but I'm blind. How could I possibly run a school?" "The same way you run this store," Morrison said simply. "The same way you've helped dozens of children here learn things their sighted teachers couldn't teach them. Mrs. Grant, your blindness isn't a limitation. It's given you perspective that sighted educators lack. You understand instinctively that not everyone processes information the same way. That's exactly what these children need." Grace's mind raced. A real school, a chance to help not just a handful of children, but dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. It would mean moving to Fort Ridgeway, Wade said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "Leaving Broken Ridge." "Not necessarily," Morrison interjected. "Fort Ridgeway is only 2 days' ride. Many families maintain homes in both locations, spending winters in town and summers in the outlying settlements. You could do the same. Run the school during the academic year, return here in the summers to manage the trading post." He looked between them. "I'm not asking for an answer today. Take time to discuss it, to consider what's best for your family. But I wanted you to know the opportunity exists." After the judge left, promising to return in a month for their decision, the three of them sat together in contemplative silence. Finally, Levi spoke. "Ma, you should do it," he said firmly. "You should run that school." Grace turned toward her son's voice, surprised. "Sweetheart, it would mean big changes. We'd have to spend months away from here, from our home." "This place isn't home," Levi said with the simple wisdom of a child. "We are, you and Pa and me. As long as we're together, we're home. And those kids need you, just like I needed you when you first came here." Wade cleared his throat, emotion evident in his voice. "The boy's right. You have a gift, Grace. It would be selfish of us to keep it to ourselves just because change is uncomfortable." He squeezed her hand. "Martha used to say that we're put on this earth to help each other, to use whatever talents we're given in service of something bigger than ourselves. You've already done that here, in Broken Ridge, but maybe it's time to do it on a bigger stage." Grace felt tears gathering in her clouded eyes. "You'd really be willing to uproot our lives? To split our time between two places? To take on all the complications that would come with it? And I'd be willing to do a lot more than that," Wade said softly. "I'd follow you anywhere, Grace Grant, because you're not just my wife. You're my partner, my equal, and the bravest person I've ever known. If you want to run that school, then we'll make it work, together." The decision, once they truly made it, felt inevitable. Grace would become headmistress of the Fort Ridgeway School for Exceptional Students, as it came to be called. They would maintain both the cabin in Broken Ridge and a small house near the school, traveling between them with the seasons. Wade would expand the trading post further, eventually hiring a manager to run it during the months they were away. Levi would attend the fort's regular school, but would also help his mother with her students, his patient nature and kind heart making him a natural assistant teacher. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace's school became renowned throughout the territory, drawing students from hundreds of miles away. She developed teaching methods that are still studied today, techniques for helping children with various disabilities and learning differences thrive. She wrote extensively about her methods, her papers eventually being published in educational journals back east. She became, against all odds, one of the most respected educators in the American West. But she never forgot where she came from. Every summer, when they returned to Broken Ridge, Grace would spend her days at the trading post, helping customers, teaching local children, and sitting on the porch with Wade as the sun set over the endless prairie. Those quiet moments, surrounded by the simple peace of their first home, remained her favorite times. On one such evening, many years after Judge Morrison's visit, Grace and Wade sat together, watching their grown son play with his own children in the yard. Levi had married a teacher from the fort, a kind woman named Elizabeth, and they had given Wade and Grace 3 grandchildren who called her Grandma Hazel, using the name Levi had first given her so many years ago. "Do you ever think about that day?" Wade asked quietly. "When Levi and I found you in that wagon." Grace's fingers moved to the locket at her throat, still there after all these years. "Every day," she said softly. "I think about how close I came to dying alone in the cold. And then I think about how a 7-year-old boy saw a piece of jewelry and decided it meant I belonged with his family." She smiled. "Fate works in mysterious ways." "Not fate," Wade said, pulling her close. "Love, that's what saved you. Levi's love, instant and unconditional. And eventually mine. And mine for both of you," Grace added. "Though I think I loved you both from that first moment, even when I was too broken to know it." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the children's laughter, the distant call of evening birds, the whisper of wind through grass. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, vast and unforgiving, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. It was a land that took much from those who tried to tame it, but it also gave, sometimes in unexpected ways. Grace thought about the girl she had been, alone and terrified in that wagon, certain she would die forgotten. She thought about the woman she had become, surrounded by family, respected and loved, with a legacy that would outlast her physical presence in the world. The journey between those two versions of herself seemed impossible, miraculous, but miracles, she had learned, were often just ordinary kindness multiplied by courage. They were men like Wade, who chose mercy over convenience. They were children like Levi, who loved without reservation. They were communities like Broken Ridge that protected their own. Even when their own was a stranger, they barely knew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Grace leaned her head against Wade's shoulder. The locket rested against her heart, warm from her skin, a reminder of all the strong women who had come before her and all the children she had helped who would come after. "Thank you," she whispered. Wade kissed the top of her head. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For believing I was worth saving when I had given up hope. For giving me a life beyond anything I could have imagined." She turned her face toward his. "For loving me." "Grace," Wade said, his voice thick with emotion. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. From that first day to this one, and every day until my last breath, loving you is simply who I am." The children's laughter rang out across the prairie. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and in a small cabin at the edge of Broken Ridge, a family gathered around a table for supper, their voices blending in the timeless music of home. Some stories end with dramatic flourish, with grand gestures and sweeping declarations. But the best stories, the truest ones, end simply, with love, with family, with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and second chances gratefully taken. This was such a story. And though it ends here on the page, it continued for many years in that corner of the Dakota Territory where a blind widow and a lonely widower built something beautiful from broken pieces. They built a home. They built a family. They built a legacy of kindness that rippled outward in ways they would never fully know, touching lives across generations, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of compassion. And it all started with a boy who saw a locket and whispered words that changed everything. "Pa, it's Mama's locket." Not because it was, but because he believed with the faith of a child that love could return even after loss, that families could be rebuilt even after they were broken, that hope could survive even in the darkest cold. He was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.